Hello, I'm Ranger Ann. On behalf of the National Park Service, welcome to Hamilton Grange National Memorial. In honor of Black History Month, today we will have the presentation Raleigh Henry Daniels, Caretaker of Hamilton Grange by Nicole Scholet. This presentation explores the Grange before it was moved to its present-day location and restored, while Raleigh Henry Daniels acted as custodian of the historic building. Learn more about Mr. Daniels and his celebrated care of the Grange in the mid-20th century. Please enjoy this presentation and follow us on Facebook to view our Women's History Month event on March 6th.
Thank you, Ranger Ann. As she said, my name is Nicole Scholet, and I'm the president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, nonprofit partners to Hamilton Grange National Memorial, and I'm proud to join with you today on behalf of the AHA Society to bring you this program on Raleigh Henry Daniels, the caretaker of Hamilton Grange. Before I begin, I do want to also give a very special thank you to Ranger Alia for much of the work that she did to find records so that we could learn a little bit more about Raleigh Daniels' life. This presentation will explore an interesting period in the history of the Grange and the efforts to preserve it, and in particular its long-standing caretaker in the mid-20th century. His care to the home and to Alexander Hamilton's memory was so noted that he became the subject of a book called Mr. Daniels and the Grange, which will be explored further in this talk. This presentation will also feature the oral interview of someone that actually met Mr. Daniels while touring Hamilton Grange 55 years ago, shortly before this book was written. The book, Mr. Daniels and the Grange, originally began as a plan in the late 1960s between two friends to write a book about Hamilton Grange as a form of activism, and they hoped to garner enough public interest to generate restoration efforts for the decrepit building that had become the Grange at that point. These two friends were Edward Anthony, who was an author and former publisher and editor of Collier magazine, and Eric Sloane, a well-known painter nicknamed Mr. Americana, who also authored and illustrated many history books. What they did not expect when embarking on this project was to meet such a dedicated caretaker in Mr. Daniels. The devotion and knowledge that Raleigh Daniels shared with them influenced the authors so much that part one of this book was named Mr. Daniels and covered the conversations he had with Eric Sloane, and the book was similarly named in his honor. Before we dive into Mr. Daniels' time at the Grange, let's dive into a brief history of the Hamilton Grange up to that point to understand how it was preserved and how it became in the state that it was in the 1960s. After Alexander Hamilton's death in 1804, Eliza Hamilton and several of her children lived in the home until 1832, when the house was sold and they moved to the East Village in New York City. The home then passed through various owners and agents through the decades, but its existence was threatened with the extension of the grid system by the late 1880s. It was thanks to Isaac Tuttle, Rector Emeritus of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, that the Grange was preserved. In 1889, the Grange was moved several hundred feet over to a new lot and was used by the parish of St. Luke's Episcopal Church for several decades. In 1924, the Grange was conveyed to the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society through a gift of $100,000 for purchase and maintenance by J.P. Morgan and George F. Baker Jr. Half of that amount was set up as a trust fund to provide funds for maintenance. The American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society was founded in 1895 to protect scenic and historic sites. It also was New York's first organized preservation lobby, but it also acquired, maintained, and opened to the public many different sites. And by the 1920s, the organization had over 41 sites under its care, and Hamilton Grange was one of those sites. However, there was also a very interesting family connection between this preservation society and Hamilton Grange. Major General Alexander Hamilton, not the original, but his great-grandson, was the president of the society for over 15 years in the 1850s, 60s, and briefly in the 40s as well. We will soon hear about the brother of Major General Alexander Hamilton, Lawrence Morgan Hamilton, and one of his visits with Mr. Daniels at the Grange. In 1933, after extensive renovation, the Grange was finally opened as a Hamilton museum, and it was in that capacity that Mr. Daniels served as its caretaker. Based on available records, we know that Raleigh Daniels was born on May 17th, sometime between 1890 and 1892, in St. Augustine, Florida. His father, Everett, and mother, Isabella, were also from Florida, but their families came from Georgia and Virginia, respectively. By 1917, Raleigh had married and was living in the Bronx in New York, but by 1920, he was living again with his family in Jacksonville, Florida, where his father was the proprietor of a lodging house. Raleigh Daniels held various professions, including porter, coachman, bartender, laborer, and laborer at an apartment house. He returned to New York by 1922 when he got married for a second time to Clara Blount, who was 6 years older than him, and together they had at least one daughter, Juanita, who was born in 1925. By 1935, Raleigh and Clara were living and superintending an apartment building on 8th Ave near 145th Street in Hamilton Heights, just a few blocks away from the Grange. And while we don't know exactly how he became caretaker of Hamilton Grange, by the time that he was listed as living there in 1948, it is obvious that he had already had quite a lot of experience with overseeing a building, both through his family and his own personal experience. He continued to live and care for Hamilton Grange throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, when another momentous occasion occurred in the history of historic preservation of the Grange. On April 10, 1962, President Kennedy signed into law an act of Congress to make Hamilton Grange a national memorial and a unit of the National Park System, quote, to commemorate the historic role played by Alexander Hamilton in the establishment of the nation, end quote. Despite the site's transfer to the National Park System, Mr. Daniels continued to serve as its caretaker. Because the house had originally served as a country house for the Hamiltons, surrounded by wide open spaces, its current location at the time in the 1960s, firmly wedged between St. Luke's Episcopal Church and an apartment building, was not considered historical. So it was actually written into the act that the home would need to be moved to a more natural setting to allow proper interpretation of the building. Despite the trust that had been sent out, and despite the fact that it was now a national park, a historic site, deterioration had set in over the decades at Hamilton Grange. The home hadn't been painted in decades, and long-term structural damage from the first move all resulted in a virtually unvisited museum. However, full restoration efforts would not begin until a new location could be secured and the building could be moved again. This resulted in the Grange being essentially in limbo for decades. I had the fortune to recently speak with Marianne Hamilton, who is the widow of Lawrence Morgan Hamilton, about her visit with her then fiancé to Hamilton Grange in 1966, where she met Raleigh Daniels.
In January 1966, my future husband, Lawrence Morgan Hamilton, flew my best friend Millie Taylor and I from Washington, D.C. to New York City. Laurie was named after John Lawrence, Alexander Hamilton's best friend, and Morgan for his grandfather, J.P. Morgan, and Hamilton for his great-great-grandfather, Alexander Hamilton. One of the places we visited was Alexander Hamilton's home, the Grange. The Grange was sandwiched between two buildings, St. Luke's Church and a brownstone apartment building. It had no porches, no rooftop trim, no furniture, and no admittance. We were standing out front looking at the poor exterior when a man appeared near us. It was Mr. Raleigh Henry Daniels. He was the caretaker of the Grange. Laurie and Mr. Daniels greeted each other like long-lost friends. Mr. Daniels unlocked the house and took us inside. It was so empty. And the things I remember were the break rooms with the sun coming in, no bathrooms, and I don't remember seeing a kitchen. I thought the room at the right of the entrance was the living room, with the fireplace on the left side of the room. But in 2016, I visited the Grange again. I was in town to see the musical Hamilton this time. The living room had the fireplace on the right side of the room. I was so confused until I walked into the dining room and saw the fireplace on the left. What a big difference furniture can make to a house. Mr. Daniels asked us to sign his guest book. I would love to see this book again. Since the Grange was closed at that time, I'm sure it would stand out in January 1966, 55 years ago. All of this was a little overwhelming for this 31-year-old lady who turned 87 earlier this month on the 4th. It has been quite an exciting adventure for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Marianne Hamilton for sharing her recollections. Within the year that she had visited the Grange, the book, Mr. Daniels and the Grange, began to be written, and the authors saw the home in a similar state. However, as Eric Sloane, one of the authors, struck up a friendship with Mr. Daniels in the course of writing this book, noted, it was not due to a lack of care on the part of Mr. Daniels. Sloane noted how, quote, it must have been frustrating for him to know that the slightest repair or paint had to first await the consideration of the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, building commissions, historians, and an overpowering variation of public opinion, while the building continued to deteriorate. Mr. Daniels sometimes overstepped his authority by nailing down a loose board here or there, end quote. The book is peppered with thoughts and factoids shared by Raleigh Daniels, including his remark that, quote, the Grange is a sad house. The sadness seems to have a special meaning. Perhaps I am only one aware of that. It is as if the general wants to say something across the years, and there is no one else to listen, end quote. One of the most remarkable things about Raleigh Daniels is that he truly knew so much about Hamilton, whom he usually referred to as the general. And a lot of times when you visit a historic site and the caretaker is responsible for maintaining it and keeping it safe, they're not necessarily knowledgeable, or sometimes there's a lot of myths and stories that are propagated, but it really seemed that Raleigh Daniels had done a lot of deep research. For example, while planting grass, he'd comment how Hamilton liked red clover. On another occasion, he shared, quote, the general liked laurel best, you know, and if they'd let me, I'd find some to plant around the place. He liked hyacinths and tulips and lilies too, end quote. He also knew that much of the wood from the house came from the Schuyler estate, upstate, and he even shared details of his explorations of how he figured out which wood came from where and how it was put together. And as the authors discovered in the course of their research for this book, most of the anecdotes that Raleigh Daniels shared were based on actual historical record. They also shared how sometimes after supper, Mr. Daniels would, quote, walk around the general's estate, end quote. By then, he was in his mid-70s, and he carried a cane said to have been made from one of the 13 sweet gum trees originally planted by Alexander Hamilton in honor of the first 13 states. Mr. Daniels would also always put out a wreath of laurel, which again he said was Hamilton's favorite, on the Hamilton statue located outside the house every January 11th to commemorate his birthday. As Eric Sloane noted, quote, there was a manner about Mr. Daniels which made one think that he was the caretaker for Hamilton himself, and I believe that secretly, perhaps profoundly, he considered himself just that, end quote. Throughout the year that the book authors got to know Raleigh Daniels and researched the book, progress was made. At the end of 1967, the Grange received its first coat of paint in 35 years, and when the book was finally published in 1968, the building had been reopened to the public for tours, despite it still being largely bare and still with structural damage. The book, which seemed to generate so much interest in the plight of Hamilton's house, also included a foreword from the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart L. Udall, who concluded his remarks with the comment that, quote, "There is poignancy, too, in the loving care that has been given the place by Raleigh Henry Daniels. These vignettes and others woven into the story tell us things about our country that enrichen our understanding of past and present," end quote. Despite renewed public interest and the author's hopes, decades passed before a site was finally designated and the move planned. Not much is known about Raleigh Daniels after the book was published, but by 1984, he had moved out of New York City, where he had lived for so many decades, and he was living on Wyandanch on Long Island, where he died in February of 1984. He lived almost as long as Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, both two of the longest occupants of Hamilton Grange. 24 years after Mr. Daniels' death, his wish, and the wish of so many others, came true. The Grange was finally moved. In the 1960s, it was believed that the building would have to be cut in half and moved in sections. Thankfully, during the decades-long delay in the building's relocation, technology had improved, and a delicate hydraulic system carefully lifted the building up and moved it to its present location in 2008, a whole 500 feet to St. Nicholas Park. St. Nicholas Park is a city park, but it used to be originally part of Hamilton's estate, and it does fulfill that mission of providing a beautiful natural setting and as part of Hamilton's original property. Then the long-needed restoration work finally began. While in the 1960s, Mr. Daniels was caretaker to a largely empty house, fighting against loose nails and flaky paint, the National Park Service has since painstakingly restored the porches, ceiling, walls, and replicated the long-missing original entrance and porches. They worked with museums that held original Hamilton artifacts to carefully replicate them and fill Hamilton's home once again with objects from the Federal era. The basement apartment where Raleigh Daniels lived is now the Welcome Center, where park rangers greet visitors and welcome them to watch a video and view an exhibit on Alexander Hamilton's life before touring the restored rooms. For 10 years now, the Grange has been welcoming visitors to see the Grange restored to its former glory, something for which Mr. Daniels would certainly be proud. His care not just for the home, but for Alexander Hamilton's legacy is an important part of the history of Hamilton Grange. Thank you.